Coming to you from the heart of the Diocese of Savannah, this is It's Catholic, y'all. Views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of the Diocese of Savannah.
Well, welcome to It's Catholic, y'all. I'm Braylon Snow, and joining me today are Father Barnabas O'Reilly and Deacon Kevin Knight. Father Barnabas is a Benedictine monk and priest of St. Vincent Archabbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He is currently stationed at Benedictine Military School here in Savannah, where he teaches high school philosophy. Deacon Kevin is the Chancellor of the Diocese of Savannah. He taught at BC, flew helicopters, and in his own words, used to herd Benedictines like they were cats. So, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. We're here during the season of Lent to talk through the topic of Ora et Labora, which is Latin for pray and work. Before we jump into the details of that, though, I do want to hear a bit about each of you, a little bit more with your background. Can we start with you, Father?
Oh, yes. Great. So thank you for letting me be here today. It's great to be with you too, Deacon. So Deacon Kevin came to St. Vincent. My monastery was that 2016?
I think 16. I was trying to figure it out today.
Yeah. So I was in the novitiate, which the novitiate in the monastery is like the first year. It's like boot camp, no connections to the outside world pretty much and stuff. And I took vows, my first vows in July. And then like the next week, the abbot calls me into his office and says, almost as if we were having a conversation that we had been having and I'm like, you realize I've been in the novitiate? I didn't say this, but just thinking to myself. And he goes, so when Savannah comes down next week, you're, our point person for their, I'm like, what's Savannah? And when are they, I just got out of the novitiate. Well, then a bunch of faculty members and teachers from our high school, BC, come down, including Deacon Kevin, and just kind of was like, hey, y'all, we're Savannah. Because up north, we're like, oh, yeah, there's that school way down south. So anyway, I met Deacon Kevin way back then. And then he was like trying to get me ever since then to like, I'm like, I still have 7 years of school left, like of formation.
I said, I'll wait.
And he did. And eventually I came down. So I'm from Western Pennsylvania originally. I have an undergraduate in biology. My dream job growing up, my idea was to go like be Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter. Basically, even yesterday, I was just like out for hours trying to catch sharks because that's, if I'm not like trying to do the things I'm supposed to do, then I just want to go like catch critters and be in the woods and stuff like that. I used to work at the Pittsburgh Zoo a little bit. So I went from being a zookeeper to being a monk. And now I teach high school boys. So like the progression is just continuing to happen well.
So you're still a zookeeper.
Basically. There's
Yes.
There's less similarities.
Yes. So I remember meeting Father Barnabas, and the reason he forgets some things is because I think he had a phone, because he got to get a phone because he was working with some ministry with us, and he hadn't had one for a year. But knew immediately when I met him. Well, all the monks, for one, was a tie from Savannah that had been forgotten, I think, that BC became a school that my dad and my granddad went to, but didn't realize there was, 70 to 100 monks praying for the school and for the boys. And so that was a really neat connection to have, which was really done by Dennis Daly, who was the principal at the time. He wanted to rebuild that bridge. And so we met, and I remember just me thinking about, well, Father, this guy will be great teaching and bringing high school boys along with the faith. He's young, personable. And yes, he does go out and catch like copperheads and bring them in. And we're like, they can like kill you in his, no, not if they don't bite you. So, but I knew he'd be good there. And so we were very excited when, about 6 years later, I called and said, hey, are you still willing to come up? And he was like, well, really? You remember that? And come down, I should say. And we got him here. A little bit about myself is born in Louisville, Kentucky. My dad was military, grew up all over. I joined the military. Flew helicopters, deployed a couple times, started teaching school, which was way scarier than any deployment I ever went on. And then after about 9 years of teaching in BC, started working here at the diocese.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I did want to know a little bit more about the details of your time working at BC, kind of the roles you took on, what you had to do working there.
Well, I started in 2014. My mom and dad had some medical scares. We were living in Hawaii. flew out to interview at Blessed Sacrament and Benedictine. And Dr. Deb Antosca hired me to teach English, which I'm from Kentucky, so I probably shouldn't have been teaching English. But I was hired to teach English. So my first 2 years, I taught English, junior English, and then was moved to the religion department when I started the diaconate program for the Diocese of Savannah. Worked within the religion department for several years. And then my last 2 years was counseling. I worked in counseling with the young men. During that time, I coached wrestling, assisted coach lacrosse, Raider team. And so it was very kind of intertwined with the young men and trying to build relationships with them, not to be their friend or peer, but to show them how to be men of God, how to try to be a man of God, and how that can be, transpire and take you through life. Probably my second year after being in the religion departments, when we got the Benedictines down, started with Brother Matthew and a couple other guys who came down, and we started seeing more monks, more habits in the school, which hadn't been seen for a while. And I think there's an intrigue about it, the Darth Vader guy, the guy that's coming in. They would come down during the summers, and then Brother Barnabas, but Father Barnabas would play basketball with them. And so I think for me at BC, all the teaching roles, anything that I taught, the boys would probably learn at a much higher level in college. I think a lot about high school that we forget, especially with our faith, is building a relationship with the men, young men, and again, to teach them how to be men, men of prayer, men of God. And I think I did a pretty good job at that. I'm not sure we'll see how the fruits pay out down the road.
You did
but
an excellent job of that.
So that's kind of what I did there.
The boys still know him and love him. Especially, some of the younger guys now might see you and they're like, but it's always great when Deacon Kevin would come back and the boys would see him and, they'd be joking around until oh, Deacon Kevin's here, So for myself, I was in, I was in formation in the monastery and / seminary at the same time for a total of 7 years, I think. And then I got, so I took solemn vows in 2019 as a Benedictine monk. And then 2022 was ordained a priest. My first official assignment as a priest was getting sent to the high school. Now, I thought, okay, a lot of times they ask well, how do these assignments happen? Do you get to have a list and you just pick one, No, the abbot, who's the head of our community, he'll sit down with you and say, so what are you interested or thinking about? While he already has something in his mind, because guys like Deacon Kevin are calling him and be we want, Father Barnabas come back. So I knew throughout my visits that Savannah would be a good spot, but I didn't know what teaching would be like because my background is not in teaching. But they said, all right, you're going to come teach religion, theology. Didn't exactly know the topic. It turned out that it was philosophy, which then I was oh, that master's in Catholic philosophical studies kind of worked out for me, that they forced, literally, they had just started this new program at St. Vincent Seminary. It was a master's program. So you do some extra classes and write a thing or whatever, and you can get a master's in philosophy. Well, I had no interest in doing this, but the dean at the time called me in, and he'll sit down with you and he's like, can I get you a cup of coffee? I'm like, sure. So I'm drinking this coffee and he's going on and on about this program and how he's looking for guinea pigs to start it off. Well, I'm drinking this coffee and I have to go to the bathroom so bad. And I'm thinking in my head, I'll do whatever you want as long as I can leave and go to the bathroom. So that's how I ended up doing the program. But in addition to teaching philosophy, when I came down my first year, I got to teach biology to the freshmen, which was kind of cool because it was my undergraduate, and I wasn't supposed to do it, but I think there was a position that opened over the summer, literally, and they're like, hey, it says that you used to know. I was like, yeah, 10 years ago. But that's that was always a fun part. And I'll never forget sitting down with you, Deacon Kevin. And for any teachers out there listening, this might be helpful. Where I was especially for biology, I was so motivated to be all right, we got to keep up with the curriculum and just, do this. Meanwhile, these freshman boys are just their brains are melting out of their skulls every day. And I remember sitting down with you and you're like, listen, in 10 years, do you want these boys to look back and be like, man, biology was the worst class because he just drove us horribly. or are they going to have like a good memory? Like, yeah, biology, that was cool. And I was like, wow. So the very next day I like closed the books and the presentations, and we got out the microscopes and started doing that. And then the only thing they remember this day is going out and catching turtles. We went out and caught turtles. And then one of my memories is like how kids would react to dissections. You give one of them a dissection and they're like, they can't even touch it. Other ones are like cutting it up a lot. And you're like, okay, I think we're good here. But that's been some of my experiences so far.
So who are the Benedictines? And then how did we end up with an order here in Savannah?
The Benedictines, where it all plays in. I fell in love with the Benedictines. When I went up to visit through my diaconate program, Father Max was my spiritual director. And I just recently did a talk at St. Vincent's to the monks and to the college students. And I made it very clear that without Father Max, I would not be sitting here as a deacon. He would keep me off the ledge. He would talk me down. He would make it very well known what he felt my purpose or calling in life was. So much so that when I was ordained in 2020, he was supposed to vest me. He could not come because of COVID, but I was given a alb that the Benedictines wear, and that's what I wear today. So I remember learning about them and just their love of life, and there's maybe some misconceptions, but the things that sticks out to me are the vows that they do take. They take vows of obedience, stability, and daily conversion. Correct?
Yes. So I zoned out for a second. I was like,
I'm
those
pretty
the ones
sure
we do?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and within that, I think what I have found and discovered in my own self is I think those are vows that should be taken by any Christian, any Catholic. Obedience, stability, and daily conversion. And that's been very powerful for me to see with them. And they take it very near and dear to their heart. And what I said at that time was for Father Max, I'm sure every monk there has a story similar to mine, that I wouldn't be here without Father Barnabas, or I wouldn't be here without Arch Abbot. I wouldn't be here without this person. But you wouldn't know it because you don't get to know every single story. And they may not even know the impact they've had on people. So who the Benedictines, who are they? Well, for a long time, they were just guys in black that came down and played basketball with the boys. We didn't know who they were, in my opinion, being an outsider here in Savannah. They've established themselves here to be a part of a school, a part of even more than a school, a family. More importantly, bring stability to the young men at BC and to people that know them. A stability that they're there for them. I've called Father Barnabas many times and said, hey, can I come do a confession, or can we just talk? And it's never a no. It's always sure. And that's any of the monks I've dealt with at BC. I think that's the most important thing that I try to share. The way they live their vows of obedience, stability, and daily conversion, which you just heard one about. Well, the abbot says you're going to Savannah, and that's where you go. They listen. They sometimes they're obedient, almost to a fault, in my opinion, because they're going to do what they're asked to do, and maybe everyone doesn't know the full picture of what they're doing, where they're at. I don't know if that makes sense, but the impact they're having may not be seen, but they won't brag on themselves, or at least Father Barnabas will not. And so that's who they are to me.
Because Father Barnabas is aware of his faults as well.
But no, I think for me that's if I could say anything about, if I could get people to know one thing about the Benedictines, is their love for one another. They don't always like each other, I don't think. They're like any family in a household, but there is an immense love there. And they take, in my opinion, their vows very seriously, but they're vows that we could all take very seriously. We all should be obedient. We all should provide stability, and we all should try to have some kind of daily conversion in our lives. And I think, so that's to me who they are. I do not believe Savannah, the Catholic scene in Savannah, would be what it is without the Benedictines being here since 1902.
Cool.
Or that's when the school started.
In regard to how the Benedictines have just influenced Savannah, well, as a whole, Saint Benedict is the patron saint of Europe and really of Western civilization. And why is that? Well, because anywhere in Europe is where the monasteries first started, but anywhere that there's been a monastery that's been built throughout anywhere in the world, communities of people start to gravitate, right? So imagine there's, back in the day, oh man, like we're trying to figure out how to survive and how to get resources and whatnot. Where should we live? Well, there's a group of guys over there that have like eggs and, chickens, and they like pray, and let's go, like, it's a good source of just culture. in addition to like they know how to read and do things like that. And so Saint Benedict, not just for the Catholic world, but really for just all of kind of Western civilization, is a model of kind of what we have today, especially in regard to community life. You know, I imagine the monks in Latrobe, when they first came around, were like, oh, this is a good spot to build. And then all of a sudden, like, you get little Latrobe that just kind of pops up around them. But Benedict himself, he came around the year 480. He was a college student, right? And he was trying to like wrestle, as I'm sure a lot of college students now, with like, well, how do I do what the college thing is? He lived like around Rome at the time, going to college, like college in Rome, but he's trying to follow his faith. And I think a lot of times for college students, there's like this wrestling of how do I navigate that? Well, I'm not recommending to college students what Benedict did, but what he did was he left and became a hermit. He went to a place called Subiaco and lived in a cave. And he was like, you know what? I'm just going to leave the corruption of the world, right? And just pray. Now, I love to tell this to people because the thing is, well, so many people are self-conscious about, whether they're like desirable or likable or good. And I tell them that like, well, you don't have to worry about all those things. Just seek God. And people are like, well, how is me seeking God going to help me with this insecurities about being desirable or good? Well, I think that the most attractive quality that someone can have is holiness, right? Why? Because Benedict himself sought holiness and tried to be in a cave by himself, and all these people would come to him, trying to like talk to him and ask him advice and things like that. And when I mean holiness, I don't mean like, hey, go and get your like, Catholic whatever clothes and like act like this and be like, oh, look how good I am. Another word for holiness is just love. And when people really pick up on, C.S. Lewis likes to put it this way, that really holy people, right? You can kind of like pick them out every now and then, because they're not the people that make you feel bad about not being as good a Christian as them or like self-conscious. But after you are done interacting with them, you actually feel like, wow, I just feel more myself after being with this person, because why? They really loved you. But they're able to do that because they're in this communion of being loved by God. So this is what Benedict started to do, to the point where he had these other guys trying to be monks that came to him and said, hey, we want you to be our abbot. And he's like, no, that's okay. And they're like, no, really, we want you to. He's like, no, that's okay. Finally, they forced him to. And then they quickly regretted their decision because he was tough, to the point where they tried to poison him like twice. So there's stories that go about this. That anyway, I won't get into all that. But what happens then with the Benedictines is we get these vows, especially we each have our copy of the rule of Benedict right here. This is the little one that we pass out at our monastery, but our rule of life really isn't that big, but it's got 73 chapters, right? Yeah, 73 chapters of just, well, how do you kind of have, how do you get the brothers to actually live together? Because there was all these different monks at the time trying to live certain ways. And Benedict, you can tell through trial and error, such as like, hey, it's as kind of broad as like, these are the steps of humility, which could be a whole podcast in and of itself. Correct. To, hey, make sure that you take your knife off your belt when you go to sleep.
I was actually just thinking that there's a section there that talks about not wearing a knife when you go to sleep. So,
which you can imagine, well, who was the monk that, they were like, he, anyway.
A sleepwalker, maybe?
Yeah, rules are there for a reason.
And so the rule of life, and the good thing about the rule is he, all throughout it, has, this is the rule of life that the monks are supposed to live. But of course, it's up to the abbot to adjust this as he sees fit, right? And so I think that really, orienting this toward this topic is one big kind of motto of the Benedictines, ora et labora, which is to pray and to work, is, well, how do we bring, Benedict talks about how do we bring the glory of God to all the things that we do? And in particular, here in Savannah, more or less how the history goes, that after the Civil War and the freed slaves really just needed to be like helped and integrated into society, let alone like support with the faith, To my knowledge, it was the U.S. bishops that were like, how do we address this? How do we like really evangelize and send missionaries? And so it was called upon of the Benedictines to send some monks. And without getting all of the details, basically St. Vincent Arch Abbey, because St. Vincent up in Latrobe was the first Benedictine foundation in the United States. So they had a bunch of guys that could move around. And so there was this like ups and downs of trying to get monks to figure out the just Savannah, taking these northern boys and putting them down south and trying to figure out how to farm and all the rest. And what it eventually turned into was our school, which was founded in 1902 by monks from Belmont Abbey in North Carolina. And then eventually St. Vincent monks took that over. So it was St. Vincent monks, and then Belmont monks, and then St. Vincent monks. And you might say, well, what's the difference between all those monks? Well, they're all Benedictine monks, but imagine like, Deacon Kevin, has a son. It's like your son grows up and he's like, all right, son, go ahead, right? That's like, we have little foundations of monasteries. Like, all right, guys, now your own monastery. But St. Vincent took over again in 1967, I think it was. And we've had monks teaching at the school or running the school since then.
I do want to talk about this concept kind of primarily, the ora et labora. So what is it and what does it mean to you in your life? So, how would a Benedictine monk live it out? And then how would a permanent deacon live that out?
So whenever I think of ora et labora as the famous motto of the Benedictines, I always like to remind people that, and I need to find like actual evidence of this, but to my knowledge, the older motto of St. Benedict is Pax, or peace. Right? And if you go to Monte Cassino, which was the first official monastery that Benedict started himself, above the door as you walk in, it says Pax, peace. On the back of the Benedictine medal at the top on one of the sides, it says Pax, or peace. And why is this? Well, really the big fruit of the Christian life is to experience peace, And that doesn't mean that, oh man, if I'm being a Christian, I don't experience peace. I think, we both walked in here kind of in a tizzy in some sense, like, okay, need to have peace. But that like, there's a different kind of experience of the world for Christians than just if you're not a Christian. That the Lord is in charge. He's our Father. Like we're and it should bring level of virtue among us and all the rest. And so as a monastery being like a little microcosm of the Christian world, that it should be a place ultimately of peace. Because if you go to a monastery and you're like, gosh, these guys are, fighting like the rest of us, then how do we have hope, outside the monastery? And while monks aren't perfect and we fight and all the rest, well, we still have okay, we need to come back, and actually offer forgiveness and like sort this out and all the rest. So we're not striving for perfection, but just to be excellent and do what the world's not willing to do. Now, I say that because I think peace, or Pax, is really the end goal of ora et labora. Because a lot of times people, especially the students, will be like, well, why are we learning this? What's the point of this? I had a student ask me this year. I was teaching on something and I was like, so what do you think about all this? And he goes, well, what's your point? I was like, that's a great question. I should tell you, like, why are you learning this? Other than your parents drop you off and we have to stay here till 3:15. And anyway, that ora et labora is, I think it should bring about something different in the lives of not just an individual, but the community. And so the two words, right? This is a funny way to remember it. Ora is Latin for pray, right? Well, labora, the word prayer, is also in the word labora, which is work. And so for Benedict, he'll give different things like, monks have a certain regimen of the day, but once they hear the quote unquote voice of God, like the bell rings for prayer, that he's supposed to drop whatever he's doing, right? And we all know this, that, okay, like we're supposed to go to do whatever important thing, whether it's I need to go to mass, or I need to go be with my family, or go to this thing, but I just need to finish like one more email or do one more like thing. The monastery, it just helps put in the priorities. Like, of course, work is important, but we learn this in the monastery, especially the first year, because once you have in your second, third, fourth year, there's projects that you're given, and you're like, it's easy for monks to have their own projects, their own, okay, this is what I need to do. But during your first year, you work from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock every day. So in the mornings, you kind of just have your prayer and your formation classes. Every afternoon, you work from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. You don't know what your assignment is until you show up at 1 o'clock, and it changes every day. And when you're done at 4, you're done, and you go to prayer, so that there's no like thinking about, oh, well, maybe after dinner I'll go and work on this a little bit more, so that you can set in a rhythm that, okay, Lord, I trust you. Like, I'm going to put in all the best work that I can right now, but when it's done, then I'll come to it again the next time. And so I say that maybe for our like workaholics or overworkers that are, okay, yeah, I'll change that, but hey, it's okay to just set it down for now, come back to it later. So even monks need to be reminded of this.
To me, and it was this morning when I was doing my morning walk and listening to some podcast, one of the things someone talked about was watching what we say, because what we say impacts the world. And there was actually a study, this gentleman, I think it was Father Dan, was talking about that a guy did a couple different experiments with water. And with water, he would say, I love you, or love, God, hope, and freeze it, and the crystals formed were beautiful. Same water from the same source, he would say hate, evil. When it would freeze, the crystals were ugly. They sometimes even discolored. And this experiment was ran quite a bit, and it was interesting here, with all the stops I had in and make sure it was a good experiment, that words impacted the world. And why did I say that story? Was because I feel like that to me is what I took away from prayer and work, with seeing the Benedictines, being around them, and peace. I have been to Monte Cassino, and that is there, and it's beautiful. I think it has been completely destroyed twice and rebuilt, if I remember the story correctly, through 2 wars, I believe. But the peace you feel there, for me and my wife both, made us want to pray. And so I think prayer and work, even here in the diocese where we have Mass every day, we all don't go to Mass every day because we allow maybe work to get in that way. We don't have the bell ringing to try to call us back. And how prayer and work has impacted me as a deacon, especially here in the diocese role that I'm in now, is making time for prayer in the morning before work starts, having the availability of our chapel and Jesus right there to go spend time with in the morning, to try to make sure that I'm inviting him into my life for that day, and trying to remind myself that what I can say in a day, if it can impact water in the way that this experiment suggested, what is what I'm saying doing to an individual that I may not even realize that it could happen? And so I don't think prayer and work, I have not mastered, if the goal sometimes as a monk is to master praying while you're working and getting it all at the same time and being holy all the time. I'm not anywhere near that. But I have found it very important to try to start my day off, not only with my prayer that I have taken a vow to do as a deacon, but spending time in Christ before I start that day, and trying to recognize any point in time when I start to get irritated or aggravated, to try to walk back the anger portion of that, because it's just the devil trying to get his way in to create something different. So the prayer and work motto, I don't do it well together, but I feel like I'm beginning to do it well separate and bringing them together. And I think the one thing that would be lovely from what Father Barnabas said was, we don't have that availability to not have the same job the next day, to forget at night what we're doing, right? Mm-hmm. But to set a time, go home at a time, unless it's going to burn the building down, and let work be there. Because in the end state, our call is to be peaceful, to honor and worship God. And when we leave, someone else is just going to be able to do the work that we've done. When we leave this world and hopefully make it to eternity with God, who we are as a person, how we represented and brought the kingdom of God to fruition, I think that's really what people are going to remember us by. And that's definitely not by work, even when you work for like the diocese or an abbey. So,
it's interesting, so to bring this to like, if there's people listening that are working in ministry and all the rest, this might be helpful. That often at the monastery, when we have visitors come, almost every time they'll say something like, wow, this place is so peaceful. Like, I'm like able to just, And all the monks are thinking like, wow, are we at the same place? Like, but some of the monks like to say, we die so that all the other people can like have this place and live. Because they're like, oh, great. Because once you're in it, just like working in ministry, if you go to, people that are working, getting ready for Easter, people come, oh, the Easter liturgies are so beautiful. But for all the people working that, I don't care whether you're the priest or like the whatever altar server, it's just like stress. And you're like, I can't wait till this is over. And I think that a part of our work, even in doing ministry and creating a culture of peace, is that it costs something of us, and that we often don't like see that until, somebody reflects it back to us. Moreover than that too, that, a part of, this work and prayer thing, of course, has like the boundaries to it that we have to keep in mind of, okay, let's work, but then we're also going to like make time to pray or leisure and all the rest. But that, I just, to put it in simple terms, I think that Benedict's intention is to make work holy as well, right? And there's a lot of writers, thinking of Blessed Jose Maria Escriva and different guys like that. There's a great chapter, my favorite book,
The Way, right?
So that he's the way, right? I'm also thinking of Father Walter Chizek, and He Leadeth Me. He writes a whole chapter on work, and he was writing Father Walter Chizek as a POW in a Russian gulag, just building for the Soviets. Like he said, out of a forest, he built a city with all these people. He was in a gulag for like 25 years after being in solitary confinement for 5. And all they had to do to accomplish the day, and I feel like a lot of us kind of think about this, is they had to work, all the prisoners had to work their ration or their quota to get their ration. And he would work kind of beyond that. He would just give it everything he had. And his other prisoners would be like, what are you doing? Like, why are you working for these guys? Like, that's enough. And he would say, well, I'm not working for the Soviets. I'm building this, whatever we're building, because it's for people. Like this roof is gonna like cover someone's head one day from the rain and all the rest. And I think that what I find often is that people, especially nowadays, like the millennials and younger, are really struggling to find meaning in their work. They're like, even when people like talk about what they do, they can like downplay it because they just maybe don't find it meaningful or good. And we have a culture of like judging. And that's why even in the monastery is like a microcosm on like, what assignment were you given versus you. And Benedict in one of his chapters here has what's called the impossible task, which is one of my favorite chapters, where he says that if the abbot gives you a job that you cannot do, then it's fair game for you to go and ask him like, hey, I can't do this job. Can I have another job? If he says no, then you do the job. And you learn by God's grace that you can do it. And I give the analogy to like, let's say a monk comes down to BC to coach, basketball or something like that. If he's like, man, I can do basketball, or, I'm really good. Like, well, maybe he gets asked to like coach tennis first or something. He's like, well, I can't do that. I can't coach tennis. Okay. But through like being able to learn like some humility, like, oh man, like this isn't my thing. You break out of your little kingdom and you realize, and this is like when our boss asks us like, hey, we need you to work on this. The first reaction would be, well, that's, why do I have to do that? Why can't somebody else do that? Or like, oh, we can just start to judge rather than say, all right, well, in humility, I can, maybe tell my boss, just like tell the abbot, this might be too much, or like, can you explain how I'm supposed to do this? But if they're like, you know what, I'm going to do this, I need you to do it anyway. Trust that the Lord's in that. And, there's some deeper meaning on how to find meaning in work that I'd like to share, but I'll let both of you kind of respond.
I think the only thing I would say, as I said to the Benedictines when I was in Latrobe, and I think this applies for everyone, is we begin to take things for granted. I mentioned to the monks, like, you live here, so this is a beautiful place. Do you miss that beauty because you live here on a daily basis? I think you kind of just described that a little bit, was that can happen. Like I said, we have a beautiful chapel here. I think people in the diocese, for them maybe listening, is the Diocese of Savannah is not Savannah proper. We have a lot of little parishes, a lot of mission parishes out there that I think we begin to take our faith and the beauty that we have in some of our buildings for granted here in Savannah. and understanding that our time, talent, and treasures can help other churches grow. Very similar to how St. Benedict started, and growing out in some of these little areas, and growing the Catholic population in the southern part of Georgia. So that's all I'll really say is I think we all have to learn and stop and realize that we take a lot of things for granted in our lives, especially prayer, able to pray freely without fear of being persecuted, which in some of the countries I've been in, that's not the case. And we need to learn, and knowing that we do that will help us maybe sit down and take the second and just be able to spend time with God, because that's really in essence what prayer is spending time to God. And in the rule of St. Benedict, the prologue, the first two words, I believe, the first words are "Listen carefully, my son." And that's where I think I speak for myself, but I fell miserably in prayer. I can request a lot of things and say a lot of things, but I don't take time to listen carefully. And I think that's one thing we can learn to do.
There was a time that I, was trying to listen carefully to the Lord whenever, so years ago, whenever I first graduated college, I went from being like, working all the campus ministry stuff and like, oh, that's great. And often I think what happens to young adults is you're in college and you have all this like purpose and meaning, and your whole life is like, all right, now you do this grade, now you do this and you do this, and it's great. But then you get graduated and you're just kind of, okay, now what? Right? And a lot of young adults can kind of start comparing themselves to, oh, well, like my buddy, he just got this job, or that he's going to this grad school, or this is going on. And, I started thinking about jobs and looking for jobs that I didn't even like, but I thought, well, this will sound cool whenever people ask me, what are you doing next year? Well, anyway, I ended up on my parents' couch the day of my graduation from college, just kind of disoriented. And I ended up working at a lab in the University of Pittsburgh. Remember, I had an undergrad in biology, taking care of monkeys, right? This is like Rise of the Planet of the Apes stuff. And I always tell people, like, if you don't like that, I'm not doing it anymore. If you do like that, well, I'm still not doing it anymore. But I guess I teach at high school. So, but I literally, I had some soul searching during that. It was like, I call that my first novitiate, because, I had like I had to like work on Sundays for like 6 months. So I'd like go to 6:30 mass and then run off to the monkey lab. And it was just me and the monkeys. And you might be like, well, that's cool. Well, no. I wasn't doing like the experiments, like the fun stuff, the cool stuff, oh yeah, I'm super smart. I was like cleaning up after the monkeys. My job was to clean up, without getting into the details of this, just to clean up after the monkeys. And I remember thinking, like, this is meaningless. Like, anyone can do this. My life, like, what am I doing with my life? I went from like, oh, I'm going to do all these great things, to now I'm just cleaning up after monkeys. And during that time, I was so just forlorn and like, what is my life? I had started going to this Eucharistic Adoration Chapel at the University of Pittsburgh. And I would just sit there. And for so long, I would pray, Lord, please give me a new job, right? I found this like a novena to like a new job, I'm like praying this, like begging God. I'm looking for like, well, maybe like the diocese has a job, or the church, whatever. And I was just so like, so every day was like, for those listeners that like every day your job is like, oh, this just brings anxiety. I remember thinking about that as I was trying to pray and listen to God. And I'm reading the book, He Leadeth Me, that I mentioned about work and like God's will and all the rest. Because I feel like God's will also comes into like, well, does my work matter? How do I make this holy? And all I remember thinking is, Lord, please help me to find a job that I can really like, be myself and find joy. And I just heard the Lord say back to me, like, well, why don't you just do that for all your coworkers that you work with? And I was like, oh, a way that I like to put it more simply is, what if I just, the Lord kind of put in my heart, what if I just make a decision rather than try to like make myself comfortable and happy at work every day? What if my goal every day isn't just cleaning up after monkeys? Like, that's secondary. What if my goal every day is try to make everybody else's life less horrible, right? Which, the way I would say it is, well, what if like, so-and-so, Bill wakes up and he's like, oh, I got to go to the lab today. But what if one of his thoughts is, well, at least Mike will be there, right? Because Mike was my name before. Like, at least he'll be there and I can do better. And I started to live that way. didn't make the work any better or feeling more meaningful, but all of a sudden, like I realized, well, man, there's 12 people in my lab, and every day I see their lives are not the greatest. What if my goal is like, that's my job, that's my goal, to make their lives just a little bit less horrible. And on the side, we clean up after monkeys along the way. I think this is what Benedict kind of talks about, of how to make your work meaningful. If you can't find the meaning in your work, then you put meaning into your work, regardless of what it is. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to do this. And how do you do that? But really with love. Because even in the monastery, well, guess what? You have to work with other monks and do other things. And there can be a lot of like, well, what are we actually doing? Like, we're just praying, and then we're like doing these other things. And well, I think if you make a decision with the Lord's help of, well, what we're doing here is actually affecting even like the lives. It's kind of like the Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life thing. When you have that realization, or you like attempt to lean in that direction to have that realization, all of a sudden you realize, like, wow, you know, because as Deacon Kevin said, I think we don't realize the things that we have until they're gone, right? Even like the work partners that we had, or let alone like family members and jobs and things. We spend so much time just worrying about, oh, this is like terrible, we complain. Whereas Benedict says, well, maybe the will of God is these people in your office, in your lab, in your school, and I'm just going to do my best to love them and make their lives less horrible, you know.
We went from cleaning up after monkeys to cleaning up after monks. I don't know if there's a correlation there, if God was just preparing him for his role, but it is there.
There's like there has to be a title of a book there somewhere. What are some ways, you've kind of touched on it, but how have the boys at BC kind of learned this practice or at Labora through you?
One of the first things that I noticed, and we saw a lot of interaction from the boys, and I think when you're teaching boys, you have to teach them and not let them know they're being taught. So you got to be very creative, because if they think they're learning, they automatically just want to start shutting down and doing silly things. But no, so with that, I think learning prayer and work, I think one of the most positive things I saw come from a lot of this was having our monks coach and be present at games in their habits. They're there. Not always, but Father John Paul helped coach lacrosse. Father Gregory helped coach wrestling. We have coaching. I'm sure you've done some kind of coaching or after school activity of some sort.
I've dodged all that.
Okay, you've dodged all that.
Yeah. Thanks for making that public.
Dr. Horn, we got to figure this out. What's going on here? Or just being present in the hallways, seeing them. We started doing some adoration. At BC, we started doing some adoration in the classrooms, not just going over to the priory. I think this new thing they have called the barracks, which is a room the boys can go, and if you go, you're like, what am I paying money for a kid to be in school for? They're in here on a couch playing a video game or talking to other friends, but there's a monk in there, and there's a family being created, and there's love being shared between them without really saying there's love being shared, which I think is powerful. So I think the biggest thing for me that I would say that boys take away, that when I see them older, is the fact that there's love present in prayer. And when love is present, you begin to feel better about yourself no matter what's going on. And I can speak for my own son, Austin. We could probably hold another podcast as tattoos, but one of the first tattoos he ever put on his body was a Benedictine medal. And because it had such an impact on him, and he would go up every summer to Latrobe. I would take boys up there to spend 5 days praying and being around the monks. And as I told the monks when I was there, you have no idea the impact you had on at least 48 boys that came up over 4 years and spent a summer with you. No idea the impact you had. You may never know until one day, hopefully, we're in eternity with God and can see what it was for. But love. That's where I think they see it, as the true love. And especially for young men, because saying the word, I love you, to another man in our society today, I think there's a perceived weakness, or men are supposed to love each other in that way. But to me, it's evident at BC, even if it's own weird way when they're young men and they're being silly, they come back and there's a fraternity and a love for each other that's just there. That's amazing. That I think it's one of the biggest fraternal organizations I've seen. And I know West Point and Air Force Academy, all of them, but the love that's within those walls is amazing. And that's where I would say they don't know what they're learning about prayer and work, but they are.
In one way, so one thing that Deacon Kevin did at BC years ago, once you were more tapped into the theology department, was each department of the school gets to decide how they assess like grades, right? And for anyone listening that's ever gone to like Catholic school, like I did growing up, it's hard to just not turn Catholic education to like, okay, here's like the test that you need to know, and here's the definitions, and things that I still give the boys that they're like, why are we having a quiz today in theology class? I'm like, because I want you to know this. But that the two grades that we kind of have is, well, we'll have assessments. So all right, we want you to write this, or we want you to like do this or present this. But then we also have Harkness, right? And I think that was something that was introduced with you, right?
Through Dennis Daly, yes.
Okay. Well, the point of that is, especially when it comes to learning certain things that aren't just like math or science. Like it was almost easier whenever I was a biology teacher, because I would just tell the boys, listen, I don't need you to talk. Just sit there and write this down. I'll tell you what you need to know. Your only goal is to stay awake and write this down. And then I'll give you a test, and then you give it back, and we're done. But with teaching philosophy, right? Philosophy and theology, it's, there's some of like, all right, well, let me present this to you. But then there's more like a dialogue, like you said, and wrestling with that. And I think that, well, one, that speaks to the Ora et Labora, that it can be very hard for monks if you have a job, or really for anyone, if you have a job where, like if you work at the grist mill, well, guess what? Every day you're like, I made 50 bags of flour. I did something. Like that felt good, right? But then there's other jobs where you're like, what did I actually accomplish today? Like I met with some people, and maybe I like did this thing. Like there's some type of work that you can't see the instant fruit of it. Just like with the Harkness grading thing, well, okay, what grade do I get for this? Like, it's just going to be on the test. Well, the boys start to realize like, oh, like it's beautiful when you see them listening, not just because like this is going to be on a test, but because they actually want to know like, what is the truth there?
Correct.
What does the church say about this, or how do I deal with this situation or whatnot? And it speaks to just like a different form of work and learning, let alone, like you mentioned, just the gift of presence. I think especially young men, taking this from John Eldridge, Wild at Heart, they suffer with the question like, do I have what it takes? Is my performance like good enough? And while that's like, we want to form the boys into like becoming the best athletes and the best students and all the rest, I think the way that they pick up from the monks, from the teachers, from the administration as a whole, of just that care and love that you're talking about, is that there's something that you provide. And until you understand this as a Christian too, right? I don't think we understand the gospel until you actually believe that your presence matters. Not just matters, but is like crucially important to the church and to the world. You don't really know like what the Lord's trying to teach you. And I think, well, how do I learn that? Well, this is the great gift of the presence of the Eucharist, right? Is you go and sit before the Lord. He doesn't necessarily say anything. He doesn't look like anything. He doesn't sound like anything. He's just, what are you doing, Lord? Yet what he offers us is his presence, so that in time, when people start to spend a lot of time around the Eucharist, well, people start to pick up on your own presence. Like, wow. And just like I said before, with like the monastery, we don't realize the peace that the monastery has. Maybe we don't realize the peace that we kind of give to others when we, oh, I guess so. I had a moment like that whenever I was in college, really getting involved in my faith and in prayer and campus ministry. But I'm still a biology major, and all the biology majors are like losing their minds. And we're getting ready for like a physics test one day. And I'm standing outside just like half asleep in my sweatpants and just like kind of dazed from like, oh, here's a physics test. And this one girl comes up to me in my class, and she's like, hey. I'm like, hey. She goes, how are you so like peaceful right now? Like, we're all losing our minds. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I don't know. She's like, are you ready for this test? I'm like, I don't think so. She's like, well, I don't understand. And it hit me for the first time. I was like, oh yeah. Like physics was, fun. Like I had to do it. It was like a nightmare. I still think I failed the test. Anyway, but I was starting to grow in my faith, and I just had this like, okay, well, that's happening, and that's not okay. But there's like so much more going on. It's like there's a whole nother world that exists that if we don't realize the Lord is there, then all our work and our everything is so stressful and anxious. So when we can tell the boys, for instance, like, hey, listen, go out and play hard tonight, but your whole identity is not in this.
Correct.
It's in something much greater. And when you realize that, then you'll play as free and good as you can. Same thing when you go to different colleges. Listen, you don't have to go, if people are listening to this, you don't have to go to the University of Georgia to be a successful human being, right? You can, like, anyway, I've just seen how people put their identity in other things. Like you're saying, when even in our work, in our presence, we put it in God, really and truly, then things start to happen.
And I think we have to be careful not to box people in. I mean, even, for instance, he said University of Georgia, or for my son, he went to University of Tennessee. I think as parents, as mentors, as teachers, we can begin to put pressure, even unknowingly, on people that they have to do something to be here, to be considered important. And I think we have to be careful when we do that. And I think we'd all be remiss if, there's a phrase, my military background, if you want peace, prepare for war, right? There's that common phrase we used to talk about. And I think sometimes that's misutilized, but I do think what it's saying is we are all in a type of a spiritual warfare in the world. We're seen as so prevalent in our societies. And you don't have to be able to go run a marathon or lift 500 pounds. Pray. I mean, that's what's preparing us for the war that many of us are losing on a day-to-day basis. And it's as simple as praying and being in the presence of God and feeling the love and just trying to expand his kingdom a little bit, bring love to someone. A lot of times I joke when I come around or whatever, and it's just to see a smile on someone's face, because I think it just helps people get through maybe a tough time in the day.
Well, that's the type of things that I think are the game changers for sanctifying work. And that, Benedict talks about in the rule, one of the most dangerous things to do in the monastery is murmuring or gossiping, right? And why? Well, because once that happens, it starts to just like break the whole, like you're talking about spiritual warfare. The goal of the devil is to like divide, to isolate, to bring about despair. And what starts that but like, hey, did you hear what, that guy did? It's like, whoa, and I think we need to have a distinction between like gossiping and real talk, where it's like, Deacon, like, listen, this thing's going on. I need to like talk about it. Okay, fine. But if it's like, hey, here, did you hear about this thing?
Correct.
Start to just snowball. That's what I mean. Like, all right, well, even finding meaning in our work could be, all right, listen, people are going through whatever they're going through. How do I just make their lives not as horrible today? How do I like bring about like, hey, how are you doing? Or like, hey, I brought coffee in for everybody, or, whatever. There's an extra thing going on, and somebody took an extra shift or an extra like whatever just to help out. Kind of just to build up the morale, like how do we become not just hard workers, but kind of morale boosters, and I think some of our boys understand that when they're like, oh, well, I don't get good grades, I'm not it, but they're like kind of the class clown. Like they know they have something to bring to the table, which is like, yeah, you can just make people laugh or like bring the morale. I wish you'd also like study a little bit, but anyway, just to help people recognize like, well, I heard it on a podcast once that we often value what we can measure rather than try to figure out how to measure what we value, and I think at BC we try to help them like realize like we got to figure out how to measure things that we value, like brotherhood, like character, purpose, and love.
Yeah, the last thing I would say on that is to anyone listening, even in your darkest hour, Father Barnabas commented on being present. And I think as human beings, we underestimate the value of our presence to someone else. And I think that's in itself my, a God moment, that would be, just being present for someone and listening, truly hearing them out. Probably can't help them. They may not want your help, nor is it within your task, but to let someone speak about it and you actually listen to them, I think is important. I think we underestimate our presence to other people way too much, because we're if we believe in the Gospels and we're made in the image and likeness of Christ, of God, and to be Christ-like, God's love. And the only way you can truly love is to be present to someone.
Yeah, and what like an enemy to that, realizing the gift of our presence too, like you're saying, that spiritual warfare can be something as simple as, just the internal kind of pride that we have, in the monastery. Like I said, in the novitiate, the first year, we're supposed to do a lot of jobs that are kind of just mundane, everything from like, all right, we're just raking leaves for 4 hours to like, we have little prayer books that if there's like a misspelling, then one of our old monks he literally has like a sheet where you have to cut out the words printed like 100 times. You have to cut it out and tape it in to the right spot, but use like a little bit of tape so that it, and like, if you come into the monastery, you know, with like, man, I have like, I've done a lot of great things in my life. Like I was doing this out of the next thing, and now I'm doing this. It's really kind of a mind game of like, well, this is like a waste of time. Unless you realize like, oh, this is for the brothers. This is for like the guests. This is for the Lord, right? And among the monks, you know, just like maybe a military type thing, or even at BC, the boys, you know, they get through stuff by, okay, well, we got to do this project, but the goal right now is just to like be with the guys, you know, and like bond and like build a spirit. But when you start to have the mind like the enemy of like, well, this is a waste of time. I shouldn't be doing this. I should be doing something else. Especially if like, oh, he just got an assignment to go do this thing for the abbot. Now I have to go rake leaves. You know, that's the enemy of, well, what? Of our pride that takes away our peace. And Benedict talks about, well, the biggest enemy against the spiritual life is pride. And that's why he spends like so much time talking about humility.
12 steps to humility.
That's right. I came up with a more interesting way to teach those for like our new teachers and stuff. You know, because Benedict is a little bit like intense sometimes too, if you read it. So I take myself as like the translator to be like, rather than realizing God is like, you know, his wrathful presence is going to get you if you don't do it. It's like, hey, remember, you know, God's always looking at you, you know, just to make it not so scary.
Do you feel like, and this could apply to your vocations separately or just in general personality-wise, do you feel like people typically struggle with either prayer or work more one or the other?
So in the monastery, we have, we say, especially our monastery is so big that we have guys that are more oriented by nature toward just contemplation. And like, they just are good sitting still, wanting to pray. They came to the monastery because they wanted to be quiet and to pray and sit with the Lord. And that's great. And then we have, you know, and then they get kind of disoriented maybe if it's like, well, gosh, we're pretty busy around here. You know, like shouldn't we like kind of slow down on what we're doing to kind of spend more time praying, you know? But we have all the school and the seminary and the guests and the work, and they have to wrestle with that. Meanwhile, on the other end, we have some guys that are just really like always involved in everything and super busy. Very just, if there's a job, they're usually like given it because they're always doing stuff. And so, you know, once again, like in their temperament. And so we like to say in our community that having all different temperaments like that kind of helps like the contemplative guys help remind the busy guys, like, hey guys, like, got to come to prayer, you know, like we're here, like, come on, come to prayer. And then all the busy guys are like, hey guys, like we have a mission, you know, this is where the church talks about communion and mission. And yet there's like a tension that exists between those two, that really it's our union with the Lord that helps make all that make sense. Because if all of a sudden you forget that your job is not about you, right? It's about the Lord. Because this can be my project, right? Or my kingdom, or like, oh, this is what's going on. Rather than, oh, this is like what the Lord's given me to do. Or like my prayer time is about like getting my own kind of like, I need my quiet time, right? I need my leisure. Rather than like, oh, I really need to pursue you, Lord. Then it just becomes about me. And so I would say that this is one way that at least realizing our own disposition, our own temperament to work with by nature, and how prayer and work can kind of, you know, sometimes be one or the other.
I mean, most people are probably familiar with the Mary Martha thing that gets thrown out there a lot, but at least in the women's circles, we always talk about those two. But I think the good embodiment of the two kind of have the both. They need to go together.
Yeah, I think if you're asking kind of in my vocation or what I've seen, where people, I think we struggle more with prayer. And I think sometimes it's because I think we box prayer sometimes up in a certain way, right? There was a guy, David Gregg, that started 24/7 prayer. He's Protestant, but he started 24/7 prayer, and they've been praying in like 75 countries for 25 years, 24/7 a day. And we struggle sometimes getting 2 days covered of adoration in our churches, right? And this is, now they don't have the Eucharist there, but they have a room that they pray in, and they may go to like a blown out warehouse and they start praying in it, and they build it and they get it nicer, and they either create jobs or homes for people, but it's all done with prayer. And I'll never forget when I was really on my journey becoming Catholic and the faith and trying to learn, he made the comment that one day he was in this room and he's watching this guy pray on his knees for, an hour, just sitting there praying, kind of how Father Barnabas and more, can sit there and pray in that way. And then he saw a couple kids walk in, and he called them pastoral challenges. It was pastorally challenges, get them to wear more clothes. And after the guy left, they put on a speaker and started playing ABBA, Super Trooper, and they were dancing. And he was like, what are they doing? And in the middle of their dancing, they started praising God and glorifying Christ. And he was like, well, that's their way of praying. Like, that's their praying. And I feel like sometimes with our faith that we sometimes we make it so much about being reverent that people get scared to go to prayer, like maybe in the adoration or the Eucharist or something like that, because they're afraid of making a mistake. That prayer is something that's got to be done in a certain way, and if it's not done that way, we're going to anger or we're doing something wrong. And I find a beauty in you have to find your way to pray. The way Father Barnabas prays, I've asked, and I can't pray that way, or someone else. You got to find your way to talk with God. And I think that we sometimes we don't let people experiment with how their way is to pray. So then it's like, well, I can't pray like that, so then I'm just not going to pray. Now that's all part of this enemy and the divisiveness that's occurring. But I do think I see people struggle a lot with prayer. One, because they don't, it's not something you're going to see fruits of right now, like work, money, monetary, boat, car, truck, whatever it is. But I also think there's a lot of fear of not doing it right. And what I used to tell the boys, there's only one way to not do it right. That's to not do it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Father Boniface up at the monastery likes to say, if you want to start praying better, then start by just praying more.
Yeah. Not
that even Benedict himself says, well, collective prayer among the brothers should be short, right? Just do it. Talk to God, and then you don't have to like belabor it per se, but at the same time, if you want your prayer to be better, then pray more. It's because often I think the first thing to go when we get too busy, right, is our prayer. And I think you're right, Deacon Kevin, is like, it's probably more the situation of like, hey, how's your work going? Oh, I don't really have time because I've been praying so much. Yeah. It's usually the other way around. Exactly. How's your prayer? Well, work's just really getting in the way, And yet I found too, as a priest, preaching, and I'm sure you found this, Deacon, is, we spend so much time telling people like, hey, you should pray. And yet I've come to realize, well, a lot of people don't know what that means until they discover like what you're talking about. There's a lot of different ways to just lean into prayer, but maybe once again, it's uncomfortable. Well, why? Well, it's uncomfortable because when we pray, we're trying to be, in union with God, but that means that I have to be in union with God, right? And my relationship with me also has to kind of come up. And that's where it gets like, a lot of people are like, I don't want to deal with that. I'd rather just like, watch some videos or like go get distracted and work or go do whatever, because I don't want to deal with all the things that are in my own self. Meanwhile, God's like, hey, that's exactly where I want to start to just like bring about this thing I want to do in prayer.
Yeah, and scarier is you have to be with union with yourself. Like you have to look at yourself, and we don't like to do that because we can see a lot of faults, and we're harder on our own faults than we are with someone else. And so, that's definitely true. Bishop, if you're listening, I'm going to use that one day. Work's not going well because I've been praying too much.
I love it. Okay, so I guess we've already touched on this again a little bit, but how can a layperson, or just someone in their daily life, like maybe a mom who just had a baby, how can a student who doesn't know what they want to do, someone who's in a retirement home or something, like all these people who are across the board bring the rule of Benedict? I know you said everyone should do it. How can they bring a little piece of that into daily life?
So really just the two things I would say. One is something practical from the rule. And then the second thing is something kind of more just, a little bit spiritual. The practical thing I would say is, so the Catechism says we can't be praying all the time unless we're praying some of the time, right? Which a lot of people, hey, how's your prayer? Oh, Father, I pray all the time. When I'm out like walking, looking at the flowers, and I like driving and I just see the beautiful sunset, I'm praying all the time. Like, that's good, right? But that's like saying like, hey, how's your relationship with your girlfriend? Oh, it's good. Like, I send her a text here and there, and like we're always around each other, and like, she watches me play video games, and like, okay, but do you ever actually like go on a date and like spend time together? I think the same thing with God is like we need to have, as the Rule of Benedict says, like some type of routine of prayer, and maybe a routine just for our day in general. But no matter what it is, okay, I'm sure 1,000 podcasts have talked about, well, start your day like this or end your day like this. Just to cut to the chase, to have some type of horarium, right, which is what the monks have, like a routine of life. And if you're like, well, I can't have a routine of life, well, my own strength finders, you could have a whole podcast on that. My number one is adaptability, which means that I don't like routine of life. I like instant response. We need this right now. I'm like, okay, let's go. But still, even with that, I realize like, okay, I need to still like have some type of just, this is what I'm going to do. And even if I fail, at least I have something to fail from, not something to, oh yeah, I'll just kind of think about that. At the same time, I would say the second thing though is for everyone in your list, that I really think the mindset in prayer and just to practice this legitimately is no matter what your routine is and who you're around each day, if you can make like the spiritual goal in your work or in your whatever of like, how can I make other people's lives less horrible today? If you practice that and really practice that, all of a sudden, right, one solution to stop like looking at ourselves and dwelling too much is start looking up and be like, well, man, there's other people in front of me. How can I like love them? And then all of a sudden you realize like, oh, this is what God's trying to do to me. Just like love me. So I would say those are practical and kind of a spiritual mindset thing to do.
Yeah, and I think I've said to you, I think everyone should read the Rule at least once. I do. I think the Rule, it's a very easy read, as in the chapters are real short, most of them. And I think you can apply life. The Rule can apply to just a normal everyday life, not just a monk. Like I just believe I've read it 3 or 4 times. I'm probably getting ready to read it again around Easter, just because there's something I pick up about it. And I think with prayer, if you don't know, that the first few words ring true. Listen carefully. Like if you don't know, just do it. Just take the ear pods out, turn the TV off, drive home from work with nothing playing in the car, no noise. Just one. One is we're never silent. We're never in silence, and without silence, we can't hear. And I think that's intentional on the enemy's part. So practice the silence and just be able to listen and hear the word. And if you have nothing else to say, there's all these little quibs and all these little, things that people say, like, this is what I do. I think one of the most beautiful ones is just another suggestion if it works for you. I learned from Monsignor Costigan was the mantra, Jesus, I believe in you. Jesus, I adore you. Jesus, I love you. And if you can just say that and just sit in quiet for a while, and I think you're going to start finding a peace. But it's going to be uncomfortable because it's not what we're used to in our lives. We're not used to that. And so learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And your prayer life, I think, can grow from that.
I wanted to wrap this up by praying for anyone who's having difficulties maybe at work, struggling to find employment, or maybe they've retired and they don't know what's next, or anyone who's having these challenges in their spiritual life. So if we could if one of you would be willing to lead a prayer, I thought we could ask St. Joseph the Worker and St. Benedict to intercede for all of us, but for these people specifically.
Sure. And maybe before we pray, today's the 18th?
Yes.
In a couple days, on the 21st, is the old calendar feast of St. Benedict, of his death. And the way that he died was actually in the arms of his brothers, right? There's some famous, if you Google, the death of St. Benedict, there's often paintings of him dying while his brothers are holding him while he's praying. And a part of praying and working is to not try to do it in a silo, but to be supported by community, by friends, by brotherhood and sisterhood. So let us now as a community pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit. Please come into the lives of those who are listening to this right now, who may not see the meaning in the work that they're doing. Please give them the grace and the strength to put meaning into that work, into those relationships that you have placed before them, to make their lives more filled with joy and less of despair. Please, Lord, help those who are looking for work and are anxious about your provision. Please affirm them in their identity in you and your providence for them. Please, Lord, help those who are in transition and feel like they may have lost their identity because of this retirement, loss of work, or just not being able to be a part of what they once were. Please fill them now with confidence that it is in their presence that you have made them a gift, first and foremost, before what they do. And please guide them along the way to the mission that you have for them next. We ask this through the intercession of St. Joseph, who sanctified work with his son, through the intercession of St. Benedict, and through the intercession of Our Lady. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for being on here with us. I think it gives us a lot to chew over if this is new to us. And I do encourage people to, if they're curious about Benedictine life, where can they get a copy of the rule besides, the internet?
It's right here. After the novitiate, we'll give you one.
Cool. Any other resources they might want to check out? St. Benedict for beginners?
You can definitely get it just on Amazon. For the first 10 people in Savannah stops by and asks, I have some copies I can give out. So notice that the non-monk is doing that. But now that'd be at the behest of Archabbot Martin, who sent several copies down for the deacons. I gave them to all the deacons to read. So, but you can get them online. And just go visit Latrobe. One thing we didn't talk about, I don't know if it can tie in, but the Benedictines are known for the hospitality. I first met Benedictines in Hawaii at a retirement monastery. And if you go to Latrobe and stop in, there'll be somebody there to say hi, somebody there to show you around, but they'll want to feed you as well. So
cool. That's great. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless.
This has been an episode of It's Catholic, Y'all. Visit us at diosav.org or on our Diosav social media platforms for more.